I'm happy to welcome you all to Berggasse 19, where Freud explored the human unconscious for nearly half a century. And you may have heard this kind of introduction many times before, but I love to emphasize where we are, especially when we gather to discuss current social political issues. We're here in the Library of Psychoanalysis that was founded by Anna Freud, as you know, Freud's youngest daughter. And she envisioned the place to become again a vibrant hub of dialogue and research. In honor of her father's pioneering spirit, as she called it, that is still evident in the genius loci of this very place. Today we are here to speak about resistance in crumbling democracies, like Freud and his contemporaries in the 1920s. We also are searching for an answer to the question how we can resist the devaluation of our social values facing the global crisis and the rise of radicalism. We are delighted, thanks to my colleague Peter Nomeyer, that the Institute for Human Sciences is organizing these kind of dialogues with us at Berggasse 19, not only the birthplace of psychoanalysis, but what might be also an interesting link to our today's topic. It's also the former workplace of Viktor Adler, who was the founder of the social democratic movement in Vienna. Today we have the pleasure to listening to a panel of highly renowned experts who are deeply involved in thinking about and negotiating the current developments in our societies. So please join me in welcoming Renata Salecl from Ljubljana, Slobodan Markovich from Beograd, Michael Roth from the United States, Wesleyan University, and Misha Glenny, who has been the rector of the Institute for Human Science, I think, since 2022. And he is unfortunately on his way back to London to join the BBC's On Our Time series. Vienna will miss you a lot. And yeah, thank you very much. I will hand over the micro now to Misha and wish us all an interesting evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much. So this is a really, I think, a really interesting event because we are bringing together the skills of the Freud Museum and all its understanding of psychoanalysis with the skills of the IWM and all its understanding of contemporary politics and history of Central and Eastern Europe. And we've got a terrific panel for you this evening. I'm not going to introduce them in any great detail because you can find out about them on the website, and we're more interested in hearing what they have to say. But I will introduce them briefly as I turn to them, and I'm going to ask my first question to Michael Roth, who is the president of Wesleyan College, Wesleyan University in Connecticut, which is a very renowned establishment. And you've been there since 2007, Michael, is that right?
Yes.
So, but he's a historian who's also a public intellectual, a scholar. But if you doubt why he should be with us this evening, it's worth remembering that one of his earlier books, published I think in the 1980s, was entitled Psychoanalysis as History. So that's going to be very useful for this evening. And he also curated an exhibition at the Library of Congress entitled Sigmund Freud, Conflict and Culture, which then subsequently went to the Jewish Museum in New York and the Staatsbibliothek here in Vienna. So, Michael, I want to ask you, we know that in psychoanalysis, resistance is an important concept when it comes to finding a path to healing. But for democracies, perhaps it's even more important, the idea of resistance, the ability to express criticisms, I mean, to act upon those criticisms. It's critical for the well-being of democracy. So let me ask you a big question to start with, Michael. How healthy is American democracy at the moment within this light? And, can we measure the nature of and success of resistance at the moment?
I'm tempted just to say, as a good analyst would. It's terribly unhealthy, American democracy. The optimistic, if I could put it that way, ways in which psychoanalysis turns a terrible situation into a crisis that can lead to healing is that when there is a crisis in democracy, you can see the real fissures that have always been there that are typically covered up by distraction, by palliative measures, as Freud used to call them. In the United States, that covering up of the crisis is not working so well. So you have a federal government that is at war with civil society in the United States, very clearly with the universities across the country, attacking academic freedom, ability to do research, and creating an atmosphere that under the guise, let's say, of protecting Jews is actually squashing dissent and forms of oppositional political speech. What's interesting about that as a form of resistance is you could say, well, this stuff must be important if they're trying to censor it. And the way you can flip that psychoanalytically is to say, well, the advantages that have come from the gay rights movement or from feminism or from civil rights movement have been so frightening to reactionaries that they are now at war with those elements. If you were a partisan of those elements, as I have been, you might have thought we haven't made much progress at all. But the fact that there's so much pushback shows, I think, that there has been a significant amount of progress around the country in these issues, and lots of resistance to it. The resistance shows you the energy that is being repressed. The frightening part for me in American democracy today is that although there is some resistance to anti-democratic forces from the Trump administration squashing universities, trying to reduce the number of people who can participate in the elections in the fall, and a whole range of other measures against journalists, against lawyers, organizations of civil society. There's a whole range of those things. That is frightening. But more frightening to me is that there is an alternative to the government's action, which is from the far right in the United States, which doesn't seem so far to people anymore. This is how these things work, I suppose. So you have a significant percentage of young Republicans in the United States who now think either the Holocaust didn't happen or that it's overstated, that the United States is controlled by Jews because they want to control the country through Israel. This is not a trivial number of people. And so as the United States is in a situation where it's the war in the Middle East is not going, I was about to say as planned, it's not clear it was planned, but it's not going as the president expected, there is an alternative to find another means of distracting the country from the crises at hand. One would be to go after immigrants and wokeism, as it's called, but the other would be to turn to the very happy anti-Semites in America who think that the country is controlled by Jews and who are ready to use anti-Semitism as a vehicle for creating solidarity. So there's a right-wing resistance to the government, which is really under the banner now of really affirmed anti-Semitism. And then there's the left-wing resistance to the attacks on democracy. And I think that there's a way in which that left-wing resistance can be combined with a traditional American affection for and support of civil society against authoritarianism. And so my hope is that that traditional American resistance to an overreaching government by supporting civil society will win out over both the purity seekers on the left and the new anti-Semites on the right.
Michael, let me just drill down a little bit. One point there, as you were speaking, it put in mind an experience I had last August when I was at Harvard, and I was having dinner with about 10 professors from the faculty, and they were discussing resistance to Trump's latest measures. And 9 out of the 10 professors were Jewish, and pushing back against Trump's claims of Harvard being a sort of a nest of anti-Semitism. And it's always struck me as odd with the MAGA movement and with Trump, with Christian nationalism's obsession with the Bible and this relationship between Israel and Christian nationalism in the United States. And yet there's this undercurrent of anti-Semitism which occasionally spills out either in the form of really vile rhetoric or indeed attacks on synagogues and so on. What is the relationship, because race is such a key issue here, what is the relationship between the sort of proclaimed pro-Semitic aspect of Trump's ideology and the anti-Semitism which you bump into all the time amongst some of his supporters?
I think the official rhetoric of protecting Jews on university campuses was just a lie. It was just a diversionary tactic. The schools that were chosen didn't have a particularly well-known incidence of anti-Semitism. Of course, there was anti-Semitism. The central, I was told, the central European definition of anti-Semitism is hating Jews more than is necessary. And this is a Jewish definition, I think. And sure, there was anti-Semitism at Harvard and everywhere else, but this was, I think, a bogus attack that was inspired by the common theme of using resentment as a political weapon. And so it's not as if there is no anti-Semitism at Harvard, but as you say, the professoriate is in many ways dominated by Jewish members. The president of the university is Jewish. But I think what's really at stake here is how do you rally solidarity among people? And the war in Iran is clearly an attempt, so far a failed attempt, to bring people together in a cause that they don't have to know much about, but affectively they can be charged up that we want to win. You see the films that the government has put out, or the Secretary of War, as he calls, or the CEO of War, as he calls himself. This is meant to just stir the passions of solidarity. It's not working. And as was the attacks on university. They were meant to stir solidarity. Most people didn't get into Harvard, so you can hate them. It's easy to hate those places that are exclusive. These are not working. The attacks on immigrants backfired in Minneapolis. So the best known vehicle in the West for creating solidarity is anti-Semitism. So I would not be surprised, although I fear this, that despite the pro-Israel rhetoric of the last year and a half, that the government can see a great advantage to inspiring solidarity by attacking Jews. It's already happening among younger Republicans and younger MAGA supporters.
Thank you, Michael. Renata, Salecl, let me ask you, Renata is a professor of psychology and psychoanalysis and law at Birkbeck Law School in London and a senior researcher at the Institute of Criminology at the Faculty of Law in Ljubljana, Slovenia. And I can reveal that you are Slovenian. Renata, where do you see ideology and psychoanalysis intersecting? So how are they impacting on each other? And specifically, I'm interested in hearing what you think about the psychological impact that neoliberalism has on human beings.
Yeah, neoliberalism has been incredibly successful ideology in molding kind of the subject who is actually resisting less than we would hope that they would. First, neoliberalism created a kind of a fantasy of choice, that every person is able to make rational choices about the direction of their lives. And the whole idea of success, happiness, individual prosperity and so on relies on this kind of a fantasy of making the right choices. And if you don't come to the desired result, you are guilty for not making the right choices, for not working hard. You should be anxious about the choices you are making, and you're all the time feeling inadequate. You are not good enough. So those kind of feelings are underpinning the neoliberal ideology, which of course we know relies very much on individualism, and are also kind of negating the possibility to think about social choices, because the majority of people are thinking about individual choices. And I think that anxiety that we are feeling, and which is also in some way getting stronger because of kind of the type of a media we are living in, and all the way algorithms are steering our emotions, is another very important element where psychoanalysis can help us understand today's feelings, which are not only passivity. We can see that some people are just consciously detaching because there is just too much. Apathy. Yeah, in some way apathy, but also just wanting to protect yourself mentally from too much. So this is kind of one of the feelings, which is also again helping people. Those in power. Mm-hmm. In the 50s in the United States, they already knew that this kind of passivity is very good. So there were political studies about that it is, great to have, quite a number of people apathetic. There were serious discussions that, if you have too many people passionate, things are not going well. And democracy needs to allow people to retreat into their private lives and not force them to be engaged. Of course, the class dimension was, very much negated here because the upper classes were always very active and they just wanted to keep the lower classes passive. So neoliberalism is an ideal ideology for pacifying people, precisely with those ideas. And one of the greatest, I think, success of neoliberal ideology is also this kind of a discourse on happiness, which is really opening doors to misery to a lot of people. We know we can get temporary feelings of happiness, but to have a happiness as choice, as project, as something that you hope your children will also experience, and that you are responsible for it, that helps, I think, neoliberalism to continue in the way it has continued in the last, 50 years.
Presumably, consumerism has a role to play here as well, both in terms of giving a distraction to those people who you want to be disengaged, but also the whole issue of tyranny of choice within consumerism, of not knowing what you're supposed to buy. Should you buy the cheap tin of baked beans, which is Waitrose's own or Interspar's own, or should you buy the expensive Heinz 57 varieties?
And here, the consumerism very much learns from psychoanalysis. you are always dissatisfied. The object of desire is, something far away. Others have more than you. Others are enjoying at your expense. All those kind of things which are continuously played out also politically. Sort of what you mentioned. In some way, anti-Semitism very much from the start relies on the idea that Jews are enjoying at the expense of others.
So we'll come back to this, but it seems to me as though what the two of you are saying is that there is an attempt both to encourage disengagement, but also amongst a minority of the population, almost an extreme engagement with politics and ideology. But as I say, we'll come back. We'll look a little deeper into that in the next round of questions. But Slobodan Markovich, I want to go over to you. Slobodan is a full professor of political and cultural anthropology and political history at Southeastern. Of the political history of Southeastern Europe. Sorry, I should know that because I've read some of his works at the Faculty of Political Science in the University of Belgrade. So he has a very broad sweep over things I've always known about him. And Slobodan, you're going to tell us a bit. Let's look at something more concrete. Let's look at the strategies and mechanisms that two relatively well-known illiberal Democrats or sort of quasi-autocrats, Viktor Orban and Alexander Vucic, the way that they use the tools at their disposal to stifle civil society and its resistance.
Thank you for this invitation to both Sigmund Freud Museum and IVM. Let's start with the overview of where democracies are. 37 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall, things are not as proponents of liberal democracies expected. First of all, there was a kind of democratic triumphalism, and the number of free states was growing until 2006. In 2006, we had 64% of global population living in free states. Today, by Freedom House methodology, it's 20% only. Only every fifth inhabitant of the world lives in free countries. 40% live in partly free, 40% in not free countries. In the period of 2015-2024, the leaders in democratic backsliding globally were Nicaragua and Tunisia. And the leaders in democratic backsliding in Europe were Hungary and Serbia, which you just mentioned, with -24 for Serbia and -17 points for Hungary. So what did regimes in these two countries do to deserve golden and silver medal in autocratization? Well, first of all, they established hybrid systems, which are neither autocracies nor democracies, but closer to autocracies, and which are based on partitocracy and on stabilitocracy, two terms that become less and less popular, but two terms that were used, and even in the EU didn't disapprove stabilitocracy for a long time. What does that mean? This means that you have politics in which the ruling party is like a vacuum cleaner, which clears all terrain from the pockets of resistance. This is very important, in the third wave of autocratization that began globally at some point between 1994 and 2005, there is no clear agreement, so this is a global phenomenon. There is no direct assault on the institutions. These are not 1920s and 1930s. You don't have March to Rome or anything similar. Institutions are still there in all these countries, but they become meaningless. They don't do anything. The second thing is that there is equation between the leader, the ruling party, and the state. So if you attack the leader or the ruling party, you're immediately accused of attacking the state in those countries. this means also there is no space for civil society. This is one part of that. So there is almost no criticism is allowed in that sense. And if you criticize the state, you may even be accused of being a terrorist. And finally, to cement their power, and here we come to the realm of the unconscious, leaders of these countries, they employ ethnic, they employ racial stereotypes, they spread hatred, and they produce daily pseudo-events and daily pseudo-crises. And by producing daily pseudo-crises, they become managers of the crisis. So basically, you produce a crisis, which doesn't exist, and several days later you say, I have resolved the crisis, which had not even existed. Strangely enough, the EU sometimes applauds you for this. And this brings us back to, certain things that Freud raised and that other people raised. And if we go a little bit back to intellectual history, to 1928, when Emory Bogardus published his book, Immigration, Race, Attitudes, he noticed in that grand analysis that your group can hate another group even if you never met members of that group. So who was the most hated group for Americans? Turks in 1928. So 90 years later, you have Brexit campaign, and again, Turkey, strangely enough, is in the focus, and one minister says 1 million Turks are just about to arrive to Britain, and some even say maybe as many as 80 million in prospect, although there are no 80 million Turks anyway above 16 years of age, but doesn't matter. And Dominic Cummings, who was the head, you can now research that at BBC, who was the head of the pro-Brexit.
You don't have to, I know already.
Okay, you know everything. So he says, this is my message. We should concentrate, he was supposed to have said to his team, we are concentrated on the third of the undecided voters. And what should we do with them? We should appeal to their hearts. We should appeal to their dreams, to their aspirations, to their suspicions. And this brings us back to Walter Lippmann, who 6 years before Bogardus analyzed stereotypes. And he basically, his book insists on how much stereotypes are important for humans. They are rigid, they can hardly be changed, and they have the power to pervert the truth. And challenging someone's stereotypes, Lippmann warns us, is almost the same like assaulting their universe. And we are in the era of post-truth, where this is very important, because spreading of stereotypes is obviously common. And this now brings us to Freud. Freud had a justifiably, I would say, low opinion of politicians, especially of politicians which he called politicians of psychosynthesis, politicians who appeal to emotions. And in his conversation with Hans Herzl, who was the son of Theodor Herzl, who lived nearby at Bergasse 6 at the time when Freud was writing Interpretation of Dreams, Freud gave excellent warning to Hans Herzl on the politicians of psychosynthesis. And this is what he said. They are robbers in the underground of the unconscious world. Stay away from them, young men. Stay away, even if one of them was your father. So our robbers of the underground, Putin, Xi Jinping, Trump, Orban, Vucic, Erdogan, and others, they offer simplicist and emotional appeals and emotional solutions. But the problem is that they do it in a world which is more and more complex daily. So we have more and more complex world and more simplicist solutions that are offered that are not solutions, that are pseudo-solutions based on emotions. And this brings us to the question, if American and British public can be tricked like this, what should do new democracies? And first of all, I should give a good news. In Freedom House reports, Czechia, Slovenia, Estonia are better ranked than Italy and France. So there are some possible prospects. But what about these countries that crumble, these countries that have hybrid regimes, Serbia, Hungary, and others, not to mention those that never even experienced democracy or hardly experienced, like Russia and Belarus. Well, I would say that every society keeps oasis of freedom and autonomy, thanks to the fact that authoritarian and hybrid regimes, they are not only repressive, but they are run by very mediocre administrators, which you know from literature on ex-Soviet Union and ex-Soviet space. And for instance, in Hungary, what is that oasis of freedom? It's basically the link that Hungary has emotionally, intellectually, and politically with Europe, which nobody, not even Orban, can really break. And this is now articulated politically through TISA party. In Serbia, it's there is still, for some unknown reason, university autonomy, which was totally abolished in Hungary. And the student movement developed because that was Oasis of Freedom at the end of 2024. And in both cases, Hungary and Serbia, amazing mobilization of citizens was made. And rather than giving you my own assessment, although I did research with those students, I will give you Timothy Snyder's assessment, who was in Belgrade to see what was happening there, and who actually was there to see how it could be implemented to American universities. And he says that Americans should know about these impressive political actions. Why? First, because it's led by young people. They're led by young people. Secondly, they advocate fundamental cause, which is good government. There is cooperation with the larger public. It's essential for these movements to succeed. And finally, there is the support of students by universities. He was very much surprised positively that professors, and at least at the time when he was there, were standing with students in spite of the fact that the government decided not to give them salaries anymore. This was all not enough, neither in Hungary nor in Serbia, although Hungary is perhaps on the verge of great change. But what I would like to say is that 2 years ago, only 2 years ago, at our meetings of people dealing with democracy, people who are much greater expert than me, they claimed, I don't know mathematical models, but they claimed that mathematical models clearly shows that episodes of autocratization in both Hungary and Serbia are such that they can only continue to sink until they become full-scale autocracies. Now, this, at least for the time being, didn't happen. And I was asked very recently by a democratic foundation in Romania. I was there during the elections, and they ended, hopefully, well for the liberal side. And they asked me, could you write something positive for the next year, like Christmas greeting, something, although you are a pessimist, but could you write something very optimistic? So this is what I wrote. The number of citizens striving for democracy and freedom worldwide has never been higher. This is very important, because you don't see it in Freedom House report. There are a lot of Chinese who express their wishes, their dreams through social media. So number of people striving is much higher than percentage of populations living in those in free countries. But the number of democratic polities has not been fewer since 2006. So there is this discrepancy, and we can only hope that this first line will win. And secondly, the previous year was in a way marked by the Gen Z. And the Gen Z is the most, it has different qualities, but qualities important for us. It's the most permissive, the most fluid generation, and it is the most ecologically aware generation. And I should give you just an example from the region. All opinion polls showed that the difference between two presidential candidates would be very near in Romania in the second round. Actually, the liberal president won, almost landslide. Why? Because the Gen Z decided to vote in the second round. They decided not to vote in Brexit. They decided to vote in Romania. So this is the key element. Unless you have millennials and the Gen Z joining all these movements for democratization, nothing will happen. That's why Snyder was so impressed seeing what happened in Belgrade.
I'm gonna stop you there, Slobodan, and go back to Michael, because there's something you said that I want him to pick up on, and that was when you talked about the pseudo-crises which are generated by autocrats or proto-autocrats. And of course, there's a specific American version of that, which is flood the zone, i.e., destroy people's ability to judge what is rational, irrational, why is this happening now, and so on and so forth. But it seems to me that strategy almost impacts the autocrat, his or herself, like a drug, inasmuch that each time the crisis that they generate is more extreme and more dramatic, such that we've reached an extent now with the war of Iran, where this one soon-to-be octogenarian's self-obsession is leading the world into the abyss of global economic collapse. What is it about these characters that is so detached from the reality of everyday experience, and why does any support for them persist? You can understand how they got there in the first place with neoliberalism, its consequences, globalization, and so on. But now when you've moved into these zones of sheer madness, how does that persist?
Well, it may not persist. I think that one can't underestimate, or one shouldn't underestimate the pleasures of submission for many people. That there is a real pleasure in following a dictator, and people who believe in a leader get enormous satisfaction from being associated with that leadership. And it doesn't depend on competence, but there is an affective connection that can be extraordinarily powerful. What I think what we're seeing in the United States right now is, in the flood the zone strategies, is part of this, is trying to find many affective or emotional hooks to grab people and to make them part of the movement, in this case, the MAGA movement. And the response of Democrats or democratically oriented citizens has, over many years, been one of, we should replace these pleasures of submission or irrational, or the madness of what's going on. We should replace that with the joys of liberal, scientifically oriented political methodologies. That's thin rule. That's like replacing great sex with, I don't know, the sex we have when you're on antidepressants. I don't know. Just to speak quickly. I mean, it's to take something that's incredibly intense and powerful and say, yeah, we should actually have a seminar. So what we're doing, and this is a little bit picking up on what you were saying about the student movement, and we saw this in the 60s, right? That's what the New Left said. We're sick of the liberal, rational approach to politics. Politics has to be affective. Being affective doesn't mean being fascist. It doesn't necessarily mean being authoritarian. There is a joy in democratic participation that has to be harnessed if the movements of authoritarianism are going to be stopped. I don't think they're going to be stopped by professors and methodologies and procedures. All those things are important. They're going to be stopped if people find the pleasures of participation, of being in a network of people who demand their freedoms. And demanding their freedoms should lead to the kinds of pleasures that group dynamics requires to be long-lasting. And I think that the effort to combat these robbers of the unconscious with the conscious is doomed to fail. Freud saw that himself. He was a partisan of that kind of politics, and it's too thin.
You have to become a robber yourself in order to combat
You have to
the
become
robbers of the unconscious.
I think you need to become a therapist or an analyst, not a robber necessarily. In other words, you have to be able to tap into those dynamics. I think the issue would be, how do you do that in a way that doesn't foster authoritarianism, that fosters a kind of egalitarianism and network participation on which democracies depend. I don't think constitutionalism will be enough of a impetus or affective charge to compete against the pleasures of hating people. I mean, the pleasures of hating people are so powerful. We've seen in the United States, I mean, the war on trans people, it was so powerful for Trump's election to talk about trans athletes stealing races from women. I mean, there aren't very many. It didn't matter. It didn't matter. The joys of being able to condemn people who you didn't understand were so intense. And we have to find I think we have to find the joys of democracy. And they're not going to be free markets. That won't be enough. It won't be like a better cold cream. There'll have to be other intense affective joys of democratic participation if we're going to resist this authoritarianism.
So we've seen the mechanisms of democracy in the United States buckle relatively quickly since 2016. Just to take one example, the Supreme Court. It's been easy to pack the Supreme Court and leave aside the most recent ruling on tariffs, but on the whole, the Supreme Court becomes just a sort of gesture to the whims of King Ubu in the White House. What about American capital, the people who are backing Trump, but also they back Democrats as well. And they suddenly find themselves in this period of tremendous economic turmoil, which perhaps wasn't quite take a look at the war in Iraq and what's happened to the markets. It's been devastating for large parts of American industry, as have tariffs. Is there any point when the much vaunted, sort of masters of the universe say, wait a minute, this isn't quite what we bought into?
That's when the government will declare victory. In other words, and it could happen, it could happen tomorrow morning. President Trump will declare victory. Mm-hmm. And it may be well because there's eye on the stock market, or because these folks who have bankrolled this presidency and bankrolled the family and contributed to corruption that likes of which we've never seen. And we have had plenty of corruption, but it is a corruption on steroids. But once those people express their disappointment or their disalignment with the administration, this administration has the beauty of having no principles, is you can just switch very quickly, and there are no consequences to your inconsistency. It's called the weave. It becomes a part of your genius. And so I think that what progressives have underestimated is the power of that irrational switching, and the fascination that many people have with that. That they're fascinated by that in many ways. But when rich people lose a lot of money, things do change in America.
Renata, I want you to pick up on something that both our other speakers have alluded to. Tell us about apathy, rage, and rudeness in these chaotic times.
Yeah, what Michael was saying in some way already kind of touches the problem of identification. Mm-hmm. So, Trump is incredibly successful in opening the doors with in a couple of unusual types of identification. One is really identification with ignorance. He is someone who is proud to be ignorant in a way. Although he speaks what a genius he is, he doesn't have any shame about his lack of knowledge. And that opens a very important identification among, maybe uneducated or, sort of like marginalized MAGA people. They don't need to now kind of feel bad about sort of their lack of knowledge or ignorance in some way. They can be proud of it. And that is really important. They don't feel that they are looked down, by him, which they felt, from, let's say, educated elite before, and the Democrats presented kind of this kind of elite for them. So this identification, and then identification also with his perverse discourse, highly rude, and his transgressions. So, Austrian philosopher Robert Fowler some years ago coined the term interpassivity, that, sort of sometimes you don't need to do something, someone else might do something for you. Let's say sometimes we photocopy the books, but we feel that the machine already read the book for us, we don't need to do it, But sometimes someone can also do something perverse, even kill for you, but you enjoy in observing it, not necessarily copying it. You might not copy, the vulgarity of Trump, but you enjoy observing his transgression. Now, Steve Bannon was very crucial, also in some way of the flooding the zone, idea of you just need to throw enough mud, even if people don't believe in it, if it starts circulating, then it creates this kind of, I would say, emotionally charged world where they thrive. So I think that, anger, on which, MAGA movement very much, sort of enjoys it, plays a really important role here. People, of course, should be angry. Things are not going well, especially for, the lower classes. Now, anger here is, very well channeled towards, the migrants, trans, whoever is, the enemy of the moment. But as Hannah Arendt said, anger is actually a good motivating feeling. Anger is something, Hannah Arendt said, that might be the first moment that kind of allows in a society a certain recognition of inequalities. But her idea was that anger needs to be channeled socially with some ideals. She was speaking about ideals of equality, rights, something that in a way mobilizes anger as a kind of a form of resistance. We don't see that. So the anger is dispersed in societies like United States. Now, sort of rudeness plays also a really important role. What we observe more and more is a kind of an enjoyment in incivility. Now, capitalism always has been, we can say, rude, cruel, and so on. But in the past, it had kind of at least a veneer among the capitalists, for the outside public, that they tried to pretend, at least, the civility. The masks have fallen. Now, even if civility is just a mask, it's a very important mask. Behind the mask might be something incredibly dirty and, in some way awful. What we observe today is that rudeness has been universalized, something that is also promoted by the discourse, especially on the social media. Here the algorithms and the Silicon Valley billionaires, they know very well that the algorithms promote hate speech because of the clicks, because they are monetizing, the connections very well. And when you have rudeness universalized, people are searching for even more extreme transgressions, which is why, rudeness might be a temporary transgression when we are uncivil occasionally in our private life. When the rudeness is everywhere, transgressions might be turned into violence, which is why, anger can also turn to violence if there is nothing in some way to articulate it, to channel it for, we can say, some kind of resistance. And at the end, I will end with envy. Now, envy is a very important psychoanalytic emotion. Now, we learn, sort of through socialization that other people are enjoying something and we don't have that. Like socialization teaches us that other people have other desires, and that our parents already pay more attention, let's say, to our younger siblings when they are still maybe sort of breastfed, and we might be envious of that. But psychoanalytically, envy, it doesn't mean necessarily that I want to have what another have, but it might mean that I want to kill the enjoyment that I perceive that the other is getting from something. Let's say I'm not a big person in cars. I don't know much about cars, but if my neighbor has a sports car, I might be envying this and sort of not wanting the car myself, but want that the neighbor's car get ruined. And this envy plays a really important role in society, that people want to kill the enjoyment that they are perceiving that the other has. But envy can be also positive. Masha Gessen a few years ago wrote an interesting essay about Russian perceptions of envy. And she said that there are black envies and white envies in sort of Russian mythology. And she said sort of the white envy is when someone, has something and that motivates me. And her idea was that, the Maidan revolution in Ukraine steered the white envy among, at that time, it was still kind of some press existing in Russia, and Navalny was alive, and some movements.
It was a big movement.
Yeah, it was still movement.
In the
so
cities.
it gave a promise. So it was a white envy, hoping that maybe something similar happens, in Russia, kind of a change in regime. When this doesn't happen, sometimes envy turns into black envy, where actually you want to kill, what the other is doing.
And
so the occupation of Ukraine was also kind of in some way, in some parts in Russia, interpreted as that kind of a black envy. We can't have it. Let's kill whatever democratic attempts they are engaging in.
Let me follow up with a quick question that's also intrigued me, and that's the phenomenon of social disinhibition, which people experience when they go online. So they start talking about themselves with an openness and in detail, sometimes excruciating detail, that if they bumped into somebody they'd never met before in the street, they wouldn't dream of saying. But somehow we've gone through a process. I mean, there was talk of atomization as capitalism emerged in the 19th century through alienation and people being alienated from their work and socially as well. But this form of alienation, it seems to me, where everybody is focused the whole time on their devices, is a really extreme form, which presumably also contributes to this ability of elites to control what's going on.
Yeah, so I think that the social fabric of society has really changed. So Lacanian psychoanalysis is calling this the big other, which means language, written, unwritten rules, culture, everything that is around us, which we create a kind of a fantasy of its consistency, although it is marked by antagonisms. Now, this social fabric has changed with the social media, in the way that we are actually internalizing, the social fabric through the process of socialization differently. And let me give an example from Freud, actually, how, sort of, I would say, aggressive feelings are sort of dependent on the social fabric. In the group psychology, he speaks about syphilis. At that time, in Freud's time, this was, a kind of present problem. And he said, the kind of social idea of social justice relies on the idea that in some way, people should sort of limit themselves, but they expect that others will limit themselves too. And he said, so let's say a person who has syphilis has learned, from society that, he should not infect others, although he actually is envious that it is only he who is ill and others are not. So unconsciously, he might want to infect others, but he has learned from the social society he lives in that, actually he should protect others. So he pushed the aggressive feelings into the unconscious. And he said this fabrics of societies is in some way crucial for how we channel the negative feelings. Now, today, the fabric of society has changed in such a way that this kind of negative feelings have not been pushed, into the conscious. They are actually allowed, to be expressed, and it is easier to express them in an anonymous way. Yeah. Which is why the online world is so interesting. And also now we are moving into the AI-dominated world, where we see also a huge change, where actually people are not only perceiving the online, let's say the chat GPT and so on, as some kind of essential beings, but actually, people sometimes experience, fall into psychosis because of a strong identification they develop. They might have a psychotic structure, but the trigger which pushes them to the full psychosis actually might come from these communications. So my fear is really that the mental health problems will increase in the future. I really feel that not only anxiety, but sort of paranoia and so on. And of course, we already see from the way capitalism is actually promoting psychopathy. As psychopaths get a lot more possibility to climb the ladder of success, yes, because of the lack of the feeling of guilt, the possibility to manipulate, the lack of the feeling of shame, and cruelty.
I hesitate to suggest we're going to try and end on an optimistic note, but I'll try it anyhow. I'm going to ask Slobodan one more question, then I'm going to hand it over to the audience. And Slobodan, there are a couple of things I want from you. First of all, I think we've seen, particularly as Renata described it just now, that we're beginning to see the contours of the links between the idea of resistance in psychoanalysis and resistance in society. Can you drill down a bit on that concept of resistance in psychoanalysis? Because we've had quite a lot of the politics, but less on the psychoanalysis. A, and B, I just want your interpretation of Freud's phrase that you raised, robbers in the underground of the unconscious world, to finish off with. But first of all, this resistance in psychoanalysis.
Well, resistance in psychoanalysis, let's start with the very concept that Freud developed. He basically challenged the Enlightenment perception that humans are dominantly rational, and famously during the First World War, he spoke about three strikes that humanity suffered: biological, cosmological, that the Earth is not the center of the universe; biological, that we are very familiar to animals; and psychological, that ego is not at its own home. In other words, the realm of the conscious is not really the only thing that we have, to the contrary. And the problem with emotions is that when they are repressed, they go to the realm of the unconscious, but they do not lose their energy, they only lose their quality. So the quality of repressed emotion, of latent emotion, and the quality of the energy of the repressed emotion, and the energy of the manifest emotion is the same, just the quality is different, which means that the repressed emotion all the time tries to come back. And this return of the repressed that Freud dealt with since the interpretation of dreams until his last work, Moses and Monotheism, everywhere, maybe even most in his last work. In reality, it can be very explosive. It can include rage, it can include, if it's uncontrolled. The problem is that humanity, Western part of the humanity, we should be very careful not to be too much Eurocentric, but Freud, when he described what happens with culture, he described maybe not only what was happening in Vienna, he described the universal condition that in culture, people actually face repression of the culture. Repression of the culture means repression of the instincts, and if instincts are basic nature of humans, in culture we repress our basic instincts. So Norman O'Brien, who commented him, then he made the logical conclusion, culture means repression, repression means illness, culture means illness. So cultural man, civilized man, it's difficult to translate into English, but we translate it as civilized man. Civilized man is a man who is ill. But now we know, thanks to Norbert Elias, that what Freud described is actually correct, but it's more connected to the last 3-4 centuries, when we really had the process of civilization, when we had what Renata just mentioned, civilité. Civilité came. So if you read Erasmo of Rotterdam, you're totally surprised what were the manners in the 16th century. When you look copper engravings where people kill ruthlessly one another from the 16th century, that type of bestiality is totally unacceptable to contemporary mind, but it was obviously not in the 16th century. So you had repression, 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 and the question is how far it can go. And of course, I am a great proponent of political correctness, but we must always be aware that it also produces counter-reaction. So repression, return of the repressed, can also be used by opponents of democracy and can be used by proponents. And your current employer, BBC, made this famous documentary, The Century of the Self, in which it basically accused Freud's nephew, Edward Bernays, for using these methods to placate this nature, human nature, in a way that maybe now produces the return of the repressed. So that's about that. About robbers of the unconscious, also it's the other part is very interesting. Politicians of psychosynthesis, so not of psychoanalysis. Psychoanalysis uncovers hidden layers, and psychosynthesis connects things that cannot really be connected. It emotionally connects unconnected things and then presents in simplistic view to others something that is actually very complex. And in relation to that, I would say that originally we spoke about neurosis, neurotic personality, but since Christopher Lasch, we increasingly speak about narcissistic personality. And what attracted my attention is there are certain occupations which need public, journalists, professors, politicians. And those occupations encourage narcissistic behavior. Although, strictly speaking, from psychoanalytical point of view, you either have it or do not have it. You don't have influence in that. But because you have it, you select certain occupations. So we are all serious candidates sitting here for that. But the problem is, if you're a politician and you have a narcissistic border disorder, it's very difficult to deal with it. And after some new generation of psychoanalysts from the 1970s and 80s, like Kernberg and others, after they discovered some new approaches to that, and now that we know about grandiose self, about the idea that many politicians have since their early childhood, that they are very special, that they are unique people in history, and then nobody understands them, and then suddenly they have their moment. That is the problem, and I don't really know how to avoid it, but we should discuss it. Leadership is important, and obviously if in certain systems, certain leaders have too much competencies that they are at the same time narcissistic, we have a real problem.
So, if anyone wants to contribute to the solution of that problem, you'll be most welcome. Casper at the front, I recognize first.
Thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. Michael Roth. You were speaking about effective attachment to authoritarian figures. So in Freud's notions, we could be speaking about the it, the S, the it here, right? And we didn't speak about another instance that can become problematic, the superego, the internalized authoritarian instance that censors and that forbids pleasures and so on. And looking at the societal level, I would ask the question, where do we find these superego structures here? And one thing that comes to my mind, when you look at companies, at businesses, with a few exceptions, most of them are run in purely authoritarian or in the best case oligarchic ways, where decisions are made by a few shareholders or by the Elon Musks of this world. So in the many hours we spend at work, most of the people will encounter very authoritarian structures that even tell you the story that only authoritarian structures do the job correctly. And is this a kind of experience that people could internalize as a kind of societal superego? So in other words, you were speaking about the joys of democracy that are necessary to overcome authoritarianism. Wouldn't one way forward to find the joys of democracy be to establish more democratic structures in businesses, in companies? And I'm not speaking about seizing the means of production here, but tendentially.
Yeah, and in schools and in other kinds of organizations. And I do think it's so important that you focus on the superego and this notion that usually we think of it, we're being punished by a superego. We want to do something, and as part of ourselves, the superego doesn't let us do it. But in fact, there are real pleasures of identifying with authority, internalized authority, with obeying the superego. And I think that there are so many authoritarian structures that people grow up with. And schools are a big part of that, and of course businesses, as you point out, other organizations are also a big part of that. I don't think the solution is to say we shouldn't, as Norman Brown seemed to say, we just shouldn't have a superego. Screw it. If we didn't have a superego, then we would be more free. I don't think that's actually in the cards. I think what happens is that there are ways in which obedience can be combined with participation. So I'll give you just an example. Maybe we've started in the last few weeks in the United States a movement to try to get young people out to vote in the fall. Not just vote, but to work on campaigns and to protect the polls, to actually, if the government tries to restrict voting, send people there with lawyers to document it. And all very rational, but what we said is that we're inspired by Freedom Summer of 1964, which is this legendary, heroic moment when young people went down to Mississippi, registered black voters. Some of them were killed. A lot of them suffered greatly, and they changed the course of democracy in the United States. And so, on the one hand, this is about participation in the joys of networking and being out there and doing things against the authorities. On the other hand, when I'm describing this in the United States, I try to describe it as good old-fashioned American civil rights struggle, good old-fashioned American civil society that Tocqueville would have recognized. In other words, when I'm doing that in psychoanalytic terms, I'm saying you could satisfy your superego too. In other words, that there's a part of you say, I am being patriotic. I am being patriotic by defending democracy. And that's a different kind of approach than saying, you are, by defending democracy, you're blowing up authoritarian society. So those are very different approaches. The approach I've been taking is to appeal to the desires that people have to participate in a tradition, to be part of something that has a structure that is sometimes authoritarian, but that allows for participation.
Other questions? One here, and then in the middle.
Fascinating panel discussion, blending psychoanalysis and politics. I'm not very strong with my readings on psychoanalysis, so I'm going to probably drift a little bit more towards the political side. Some of the psychological tools or levers that have been mentioned that the Autocrats used is one, creating an object of hate to distract from the crisis at hand. Another tool or trick or maneuver was used was creating a pseudo-crisis where you come out and solve it to make you look like you're the master of the universe or the one who can provide the solutions. From our side, to promote democracy and free society, what counters do we have to these tricks, or what psychological or psychoanalytical tools can we employ?
Renata, do you want to
I
have a
think,
go at that one?
First, we should understand that actually psychoanalysis is going in a different direction than utilitarianism. So we need to understand that, utilitarianism has been promoting the idea that people want to maximize their, happiness, their well-being, and minimalize their pain. And psychoanalysis shows the opposite. So
to maximize the pain,
yes,
the happiness.
you find enjoyment
Great.
in pain, and this, you might actually not do anything. You kind of let's say resist to resist. So that's this kind of passivity of the subject, and subject not doing things that will contribute to his or her well-being. We need to understand that is something important, when we discuss why people are not rebelling more. And then, of course, the superego also has, another kind of element to it, that it sort of kind of pushes you to enjoyment. It's not only prohibiting element, it's kind of a mocking inner voice, which also says, oh, you should enjoy, but you aren't enjoying, and so on. You should enjoy more, and then you start searching for who might be stealing your enjoyment.
They're enjoying more than
you are. Now, a very important element where psychoanalysis can help us, what's happening today, is also death drive. So Freud was speaking about death drive in the meaning of that, in a way, the death drive is linked to the kind of the erotic drive, the life drive. And death drive doesn't mean simply a complete kind of a self-annihilation. Lacan was also speaking about death drive being linked to creatio ex nihilo, kind of a desire for renewal, for restart. And that we see now in politics. A desire for reset. So when you look at the evangelical Christians' ideology, and they're waiting for the second coming of Christ, it comes after the pandemic, after the war, especially the war in the Middle East, and the desire is that a restart happens. And a lot of people who are sharing conspiracy theories and fake news actually do not believe in what they are sharing. There was an interesting research a few years ago done by American and Danish political scientists analyzing about 6,000 of passionate spreaders of fake news and conspiracy theories, asking them, do you believe what you're spreading? 3/4 didn't believe in what they are spreading. Now, why are they spreading? Not to convince others necessarily in these ideas, but to stir emotions and to get recognition in their own group, likes. And when you stir emotion of anger on the other side, in another group, when they hatefully respond, you also get recognition. So people want to be recognized more than anything.
It's emotional engagement.
Yeah.
It's like when two people split up as a couple and one of them doesn't want to let go and will do anything, including anger, to ensure that there remains an emotional bond.
Yes. Yes.
Interesting. So we've got time for a couple more questions. I would like one there and then one in the middle.
Oh, it's me?
Yes,
Okay.
it's you.
It's interesting that there's one person I think you haven't named yet, which is Jeffrey Epstein. and I'm linked. Because I'm thinking that you were talking a moment ago about the superego. To me, there is actually a rather facile explanation. We have Trump in the figure of the superego, a very perverse, a very corrupt father figure who is apparently allowed every corrupt and indecent thing in the world, of the kind I haven't seen in my life. And so it gives allowance to others to do, I think, very much the same, and also knowing that they're not going to be punished for it. But rather, if you think of the people who stormed the Capitol being worshipped as patriotic heroes. But I think a possible Gegner, a possible opponent to Trump in terms of perversity is Epstein, whom I actually have to admit I didn't take very seriously, but I am beginning to take more and more seriously with more and more of the stories coming out. And I found it very interesting that somebody as horrific as Marjorie Greene, for her, the reason to give up her seat in Georgia was the Epstein affair. So I'm wondering to what extent, with all the perversity that's going on, whether the childhood, the child sexual abuse and the stories are becoming, more and more out at the age, it's no longer adolescents, but young kids, and you have films and what. Whether this, because I'm becoming desperate to find something that would stick to Trump, could be the one thing that could, in all the pleasures that you've been, I think, very correctly talked about, be the one thing that could get to him.
Arguably,
in addition to the
arguably, the conspiracy theorists were right, except they were looking at a pizza parlor in northwestern DC in the wrong direction from where it was actually going on. And the irony is that central to the whole Epstein story is the very man who has been promoting all of these conspiracy theories, perhaps again as a way of deflecting his own responsibility. But I think,
as an anthropologist, do you think it's because that story, this Epstein story, touches something universal that people just, or do you not see it that way? I know you're very interested in the intersection of universal norms and universal features and particular events. I just wonder if that's why this might stick, because it's something that goes beyond a particular event.
That could explain why it's globally dealt with. But I think that with that story, we see all the divisions of the world that we have today. And you can see that it's used also by the robbers of the unconscious in authoritarian and totalitarian states to say, this is the West. This is what we have been telling you all the time. Now we have finally the proof. And it has totally different dynamics in the United States, where it is an internal debate about what's wrong with the American democracy and how could this happen at all. But I think that many societies had a similar, discussions like with the Catholic Church and with everything that and the other churches that was happening. Simply, it has a universal element, but it is expressed in very, very local settings and with from very different positions.
but I mean, it's surely, in the case of the United States, it's very, very telling that the only person who has been made accountable for Epstein is a woman. And this is such a deep irony when you see this massive network of politicians, industrialists, bankers, all engaged in this utterly, utterly vile activity. With the exception of Peter Mandelson, as far as I can see, and to some extent Miroslav Lajčák, they get away with it. I mean, you know, despite the fact that this has been exposed as one of the most unbelievable networks of abuse and corruption of power that we have ever seen.
Well, that brings us back to a colleague of ours who was at IVM, Prune Antoine. You chaired the session, who wrote the book on Diabolical Mother, and about a famous case. Basically it shows how much legal establishment are still discriminating women in Western societies. And on psychological accounts.
We've got time for one more question, and there in the middle, very persistent hand. I haven't got my long-distance glasses, and
Thank
so
you very
I
much
can't
indeed.
see who's who.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I'm thinking at Romania when, due to TikTok, a certain Ceausescu was extremely successful. Now you could say this is an unexperienced voter voting. However, when you look at Great Britain, I mean, going to London may be interesting. Nigel Farage is already waiting there. He again now is leading in the polls, and especially a TikTok star. Absolute TikTok star. Now, isn't it also a lot about entertainment? People, especially in partly affluent societies, they love entertainment. What about that? Which may take a bad end, but it's an issue.
Can I just say briefly, I shouldn't do this, but I ought to just, in the United Kingdom, that Boris Johnson is objectively a more entertaining character than Nigel Farage, and he blew it. But it's certainly true. Interestingly, about Farage is that Reform's ratings over the past 6 weeks to 2 months have started to go down perceptibly, and one of the reasons is because he's so associated with Donald Trump, and he also, because of that association with Donald Trump, who is not a popular figure in the United Kingdom, he backs the Iran war, and that is very unpopular in the United Kingdom. So, but in terms of entertainment, there's no question that Trump and Johnson in particular came at a particular moment in history, and they were show people.
The thing about entertainment, though, it can work for a while.
Yep.
And then suddenly, the thing you thought was going to be mind-blowing, tons of likes, circulating wildly, suddenly doesn't work anymore. And I mean, the psychodynamics of spectacle and how it responds to the needs of voters or young people more generally, and then doesn't. I mean, I think it's we have very well-paid people who are supposed to be able to predict how the video, let's say, of blowing up buildings in Iran is going to just turn on young people and make them support the war, and it turns out just the opposite. And so I think the one thing about the unconscious is that it doesn't always behave like we expect it to. And even people who seem to want to master it, they get caught up by that surprise.
Well, on that note, I'm afraid we're going to have to bring it to an end, but I think it's an optimistic note because things aren't going to turn out the way that Trump thinks they will. So before we all disperse, let me thank my collaborator, Peter Neumeyer, from the Freud Museum, who came up with this idea in the first place. Thank you very much, Peter. It was a great idea, and it's been terrific working with you. But even more than that, I want a stormy round of applause for my three panelists, Roth, Michael Roth, Renata, and Renata, I've now, your surname's got a... Salecl. And Slobodan Markovich, Larko.